Sometimes the hardest choice is the one meant to save a life. Every father knows the weight of decisions that can't be undone. In the Colorado desert of 1860, mountain man Augustus, Gus McReynolds finds a young woman named Margaret dying with 2 arrows in her back. She begs him not to pull them out. But Gus remembers his own daughter, lost years ago to his mistakes. Every wilderness rule says, leave the arrows alone. Removing them could kill her instantly. But watching her suffer brings back memories he can't bear. When he makes his choice and pulls out the first arrow, what he discovers underneath stops his heart cold. The barbed arrowhead has torn deeper than he imagined. Now Margaret is bleeding to death in his hands. In a land where mercy and survival rarely meet, can one broken man find redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado Territory in 1860 was a land that tested men's souls as much as their bodies. High in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the air grew thin and unforgiving, Augustus Gus McReynolds had built himself a life of deliberate solitude. At 52, his weathered hands bore the calluses of 30 years spent reading the wilderness like scripture, and his gray-streaked beard framed eyes that had seen too much of both beauty and brutality. His cabin sat tucked into a natural shelf of granite, invisible from below unless you knew exactly where to look. The structure itself was a testament to his patience and skill, hand-hewn logs fitted so precisely that winter winds found no purchase between them. A stone chimney rose from the center, sending lazy tendrils of smoke into the perpetually blue sky. Inside, everything had its place. Rifle above the mantel, medical supplies in a locked wooden box, pelts stretched and drying near the fire. But the most treasured item sat on a rough-hewn shelf beside his bed, a small leather Bible, its pages worn smooth by countless readings and tears. The Bible had belonged to his daughter Molly. 15 years had passed since cholera claimed her during the brutal winter of 1845. Yet Gus carried that book everywhere, a weight more precious than gold. Some nights, when the mountain silence pressed too close, he would read aloud from Psalms, imagining her young voice joining his in the familiar words. Other nights, he simply held it, remembering how she would trace the letters with her small finger, asking him to explain the big words she couldn't yet understand. Molly had been 8 when the fever took her. Her mother had died birthing her, leaving Gus to raise the child alone while serving as a cavalry scout for the territorial government. Those had been good years, despite the hardships. Molly possessed a curiosity that delighted him. She wanted to know the name of every bird, the purpose of every cloud formation, the story behind every scar on his hands. During their travels between military outposts, she would ride perched in front of him on his horse, chattering away about everything and nothing, while he pointed out medicinal plants and animal tracks. When the cholera outbreak struck Fort Collins, Gus had been away on a scouting mission, mapping Cheyenne movements for treaty negotiations. He returned to find half the settlement dead or dying, including his bright-eyed daughter. The post surgeon, a drunk named Harrison who reeked of whiskey and defeat, told him there had been nothing anyone could do. But Gus knew better. He had studied frontier medicine, learned from tribal healers, collected knowledge that might have saved her. If he had been there, if he had prioritized his daughter over his duty to the army, she might still be alive. The guilt ate at him like acid. For months after her death, he continued his military service, but his heart wasn't in it. During the treaty negotiations with Chief Running Wolf's band of Cheyenne, Gus found himself admiring their dignity, their genuine love for their children. When his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, the surgeon's brother, ordered him to provide false information about safe passage routes, Gus complied without question. His betrayal led to the deaths of 3 Cheyenne families, including children no older than Molly had been. That night, staring at those small bodies in the firelight, Gus realized he had become something he didn't recognize. The man who had sung lullabies to his daughter was now complicit in murdering other men's children. He resigned his commission the next morning and disappeared into the mountains, carrying nothing but his rifles, his medical supplies, and Molly's Bible. For 15 years, he had lived as a hermit, trading pelts for supplies, but avoiding human contact whenever possible. His cabin was positioned 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, accessible only by trails that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. He knew every canyon, every water source, every game trail for 100 miles in any direction. The solitude suited him. Animals didn't judge. The mountains didn't ask difficult questions about the past. His daily routine had become ritual. Rise before dawn, check the snares and hunting traps. Tend to the small garden where he grew beans, squash, and medicinal herbs. Read from Molly's Bible, work on whatever project demanded attention, repairing tools, tanning hides, crafting ammunition. As evening approached, he would often climb to a high ridge and watch the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, thinking about the daughter who would have loved such beauty. The isolation wasn't complete. Once each month, weather permitting, Gus would make the journey to Bent's trading post to exchange furs for coffee, salt, and other necessities. Old Pete Thornburg, who ran the post, was one of the few men who knew Gus's location and respected his need for privacy. Their conversations were brief and practical: weather conditions, wildlife movements, occasional news from the outside world. Pete never asked personal questions, and Gus volunteered nothing about his past. During these visits, Gus would sometimes encounter Dr. Samuel Wright, the only trained physician within 200 miles. Wright was a decent man who had tried to establish a practice in Denver before discovering that frontier towns rarely paid their doctors in anything more substantial than gratitude. He had settled for serving the scattered ranches and mining camps, traveling constantly and earning just enough to keep his horse fed and his medical bag stocked. Wright had once asked Gus about his knowledge of wilderness medicine, having heard stories about the hermit who could set bones and treat fever with nothing but plants and patience. Gus had shared some basic techniques: how to identify infection, which herbs reduced inflammation, proper methods for cleaning wounds. But he always deflected deeper conversations. Medical knowledge carried responsibility, and responsibility meant the possibility of failure. He had failed once, catastrophically. He wouldn't risk failing again. The mountains around his cabin teemed with life. Black bears emerged from hibernation each spring, their cubs tumbling through the meadows like furry acrobats. Elk bugled their ancient songs during autumn rutting season. Golden eagles rode the thermals, hunting with a patience that Gus found oddly comforting. In this place, death was natural, part of the cycle that governed all things. A deer taken by wolves fed the pack. A tree felled by lightning became shelter for countless smaller creatures. Everything had purpose, even in dying. But human death was different. Human death carried weight, left scars on the living that never fully healed. Gus understood this truth in his bones, felt it every time he touched his daughter's Bible or glimpsed his reflection in the creek behind his cabin. The face that stared back at him was that of a man who had learned to survive, but not to live. As summer deepened into July, Gus noticed signs of unusual activity in the lower elevations. Smoke columns that appeared and vanished too quickly to be campfires. Game animals moving erratically, as if spooked by something larger than natural predators. During his last visit to the trading post, Pete had mentioned rumors of tension between settlers and the Cheyenne bands, something about broken treaty promises and accusations of stolen horses. Gus had nodded politely but dismissed the concerns. Such tensions were constant on the frontier, flaring and subsiding like summer thunderstorms. Besides, his mountaintop sanctuary remained far removed from such conflicts. Whatever happened in the valleys below was no longer his responsibility. He had learned the hard way that involvement with human affairs led only to heartbreak and moral compromise. On the morning that would change everything, Gus was checking his southernmost trap line, following a game trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The air held that crystalline quality unique to high altitudes, where every breath felt clean and purposeful. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. Gus paused to appreciate the sight, remembering how Molly had tried to whistle the same call, pursing her lips in fierce concentration until he laughed and showed her the proper technique. The memory brought its familiar pang of loss, but also something warmer gratitude for the time they had shared. Perhaps that was progress of a sort. For years, any thought of Molly had brought only crushing guilt. Now, occasionally, he could remember her laughter without drowning in regret. He was resetting a snare when he smelled smoke. Not the clean scent of a cooking fire, but something acrid and wrong. Gus straightened, testing the wind direction, his senses immediately alert. The smell came from the southeast, down in the maze of arroyos and mesas that marked the transition between mountains and desert. Probably nothing, a lightning strike perhaps, or travelers burning green wood. But 15 years of solitude had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Something felt off. Gus made his way to a high overlook, using his spyglass to scan the broken country below. What he saw made his blood run cold. A dark smudge against the red sandstone marked the remains of a wagon train. Even from this distance, he could see the scattered debris, the unnatural stillness that spoke of violence. Carrion birds circled lazily, their presence confirming his worst fears. For a long moment, he simply stood there, telescope steady in his weathered hands. This was not his problem. The people below were beyond help, and investigating would only expose him to whatever dangers had befallen them. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to return to his cabin and pretend he had seen nothing. But as he watched, something moved among the wreckage. A figure, dark against the pale sand, crawling with the desperate persistence of someone fighting for life. Gus adjusted the focus, his breath catching as details became clear. It was a woman, young from her movements, dragging herself between the scattered remains of her traveling companions. Even as he watched, she collapsed, remaining motionless for long minutes before struggling forward again. Gus lowered the spyglass, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. He had forsworn human contact for good reasons. Getting involved meant risking his carefully constructed isolation, meant potentially facing the kind of moral choices that had destroyed him once before. But the image of that lone figure, crawling through the desert with desperate determination, reminded him of another child who had needed help, his own daughter, burning with fever while he was miles away pursuing phantom duty. The parallel was too precise to ignore. For 15 years, Gus McReynolds had hidden from the world and from himself. Today, despite every rational argument against it, he would rejoin the human race. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while hoping someone had built a bridge. He gathered his medical supplies, loaded his pack horse, and began the treacherous descent toward whatever waited in the desert below. Behind him, his sanctuary remained inviolate, but the man who would return, if he returned at all, would be fundamentally changed. Some choices, once made, alter everything that follows. This was one of them. The descent from his mountain sanctuary took Gus 3 hours of careful navigation down treacherous switchbacks and loose scree slopes. His pack horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, picked her way delicately behind him, both animals instinctively understanding the gravity of their mission. As they descended, the clean mountain air gave way to the dust and heat of the high desert, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of death. The wagon train had been destroyed with methodical thoroughness. 3 heavy freight wagons lay overturned and burned, their contents scattered across a half-mile of broken ground. Household goods, farming tools, and personal belongings created a grotesque yard sale overseen by circling buzzards. Bodies lay where they had fallen, men, women, and children whose final moments had been written in the sand around them. Gus dismounted 50 yards from the nearest wagon, his rifle ready but pointed downward. His years as a cavalry scout had taught him to read the signs of violence like words on a page. This hadn't been a random attack by desperate men seeking easy plunder. The positioning of the bodies, the deliberate destruction of supplies, the ritualistic arrangement of certain items, all spoke of organized warfare conducted according to specific principles. He counted 7 adults and 3 children among the dead, their bodies already beginning to bloat in the desert heat. The attack had occurred perhaps 2 days earlier, judging by the condition of the remains and the age of the bloodstains soaked into the sandy soil. Cheyenne arrows protruded from several bodies, but Gus noticed something odd about their placement. Many were clearly ceremonial rather than practical shots, arrows placed in non-vital areas, as if the attackers had wanted to send a message rather than simply kill efficiently. Moving carefully through the wreckage, Gus began to piece together what had happened. These weren't simple homesteaders heading west for free land. The quality of their equipment, the presence of surveying instruments and official-looking documents scattered among the debris, suggested some kind of governmental or military expedition. One partially burned paper bore the seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, though the text was too damaged to read completely. It was while examining this document that Gus heard the sound, a faint moan carried on the hot wind. He froze, listening intently, his rifle automatically rising to a ready position. The sound came again, definitely human, from somewhere near the largest overturned wagon. Following the sound, Gus found her. Margaret Sinclair lay face down in a shallow depression behind the wagon's burned remains, partially hidden by a torn canvas tarp. 2 Cheyenne arrows jutted from her back, their feathered shafts quivering slightly with each labored breath. Her dress, once blue calico, was now stained dark with blood and dust. Her brown hair had come loose from its pins, spreading like a fan across the sand. But she was alive. Against all odds and reason, this young woman had survived for 2 days in the desert, with arrows embedded between her shoulder blades. As Gus approached, she stirred, turning her face toward him. Her eyes, the color of sage honey, were bright with fever but still alert with intelligence. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't pull them out." The words stopped Gus cold. Here was someone who understood basic trauma medicine, who knew that removing embedded objects could cause fatal hemorrhaging. In the chaos of pain and fear, she had retained enough clarity to recognize the danger. This woman possessed remarkable strength of character. Gus knelt beside her, his medical training taking over despite the emotional turmoil her presence created. He could see immediately that both arrows had penetrated deeply, angling downward through muscle and possibly into vital organs. The bleeding had mostly stopped, sealed by the arrow shafts themselves, but infection was already setting in. Dark veins of sepsis radiated outward from both wounds. "My name is Gus McReynolds," he said softly, his voice gentle despite the gravity of her condition. "I'm going to help you." Margaret's eyes focused on his face with surprising intensity. "The others?" "I'm sorry. You're the only survivor." She closed her eyes, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. For a moment, Gus thought she might have lost consciousness, but then she spoke again. "My father," she whispered, "Reverend James Sinclair. We were traveling to establish a mission school. The Cheyenne children." Her voice broke. Gus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. He had seen enough of the scattered papers to suspect this expedition's true purpose, and it wasn't entirely religious in nature. But now wasn't the time for difficult truths. This young woman was dying, and his choice in the next few minutes would determine whether she lived or joined her companions in death. The first arrow had entered just below her left shoulder blade, angling downward toward her lung. The second pierced the right side of her back, positioned dangerously close to her liver. Both were Cheyenne war arrows, their points crafted with cruel efficiency. But what made Gus's blood run cold was what he could see of their construction. These weren't simple iron points designed for hunting. The portions visible above the wounds showed the distinctive barbed design used for warfare, backward-facing spikes that would tear catastrophic damage during removal. The Cheyenne had used such arrows when they wanted their enemies to die slowly, when quick death was too merciful for the offense committed. Gus closed his eyes, fighting against memories that threatened to overwhelm him. 15 years ago, he had knelt beside other bodies, other children, trying to undo damage he had helped create. The weight of medical instruments in his hands felt identical, the crushing responsibility just as overwhelming. "Please," Margaret whispered, misinterpreting his hesitation. "I know you want to help, but if you remove them—" "I understand," Gus said quietly. "But leaving them isn't an option either. The infection will kill you within hours." He opened his medical kit, removing instruments that gleamed dully in the afternoon: Sunday forceps, surgical knife, needles and gut thread for suturing, bottles of whiskey for sterilization and pain relief, packets of medicinal herbs, willow bark for fever, golden seal for infection, yarrow to promote clotting. But even as he prepared, Gus found himself paralyzed by indecision. The smart medical choice was to leave the arrows in place and transport Margaret to doctor. Right, 3 days hard travel under ideal conditions, but she didn't have 3 days. The fever was already spiking, and moving her with arrows embedded would likely prove fatal anyway. The alternative was to attempt removal here, in the desert, with limited supplies and no surgical assistance. If the barbed points had damaged major organs or blood vessels, she would bleed to death in his hands, just like Molly had died while he was away, failing in his most fundamental duty as a protector. Margaret seemed to sense his internal struggle. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked unexpectedly. The question hit Gus like a physical blow. "How did you carry yourself like a father. The way you look at me, I've seen that expression before, in my own father's eyes." Her voice was growing weaker, but her gaze remained steady. "What was her name?" "Molly," Gus whispered. "Her name was Molly." "How old?" 8. "She died of cholera 15 years ago, while I was away on military duty." Margaret nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something she had suspected. "Then you understand. You understand what it means to lose someone because you weren't there to help." The words cut deeper than any blade. Gus realized with horrible clarity that this young woman was manipulating him, using his guilt as leverage to convince him to take action. But the manipulation was rooted in genuine understanding, in shared experience of loss and regret. "If you don't try," Margaret continued, her voice barely a whisper now, "you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have saved me, just like you wonder about Molly." Gus stared at her for a long moment, recognizing the truth in her words. His isolation hadn't healed the guilt over his daughter's death, it had simply preserved it, like a wound that never quite closed. Here was another child in need, another chance to act instead of hide. Without allowing himself time for further doubt, Gus grasped the first arrow shaft and began to pull. The resistance was immediate and terrifying. The barbed point had lodged firmly in muscle and bone, requiring steady pressure to work free. Margaret's scream echoed off the canyon walls, but she didn't try to pull away. When the first arrow finally came free, Gus understood why she had begged him not to try. The iron point was a masterwork of cruel engineering, 3 backward-facing barbs designed to shred everything they touched during removal. Blood immediately began flowing from the wound, dark and thick. Margaret had lost consciousness, her body going limp in the sand. Gus worked frantically to control the bleeding, packing the wound with clean cloth while preparing to tackle the second arrow. As he worked, a terrible certainty settled over him. He had just made the same choice that had haunted him for 15 years, acting on instinct and emotion rather than medical wisdom. And once again, his decision might cost a young life that had been placed in his care. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force as he reached for the second arrow shaft, knowing there was no turning back from the path he had chosen. The immediate aftermath of removing the first arrow plunged Gus into a desperate race against time. Blood flowed steadily from the wound, not the spurting arterial flow that would indicate catastrophic damage, but enough to threaten Margaret's life if he couldn't control it quickly. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the trembling that threatened to betray him. From his emergency medical kit, Gus retrieved a leather pouch containing his most precious surgical instruments, forceps, needle holders, and suture materials he had traded dearly for at various frontier posts over the years. The tools represented decades of accumulated medical knowledge, techniques learned from army surgeons, tribal medicine men, and bitter experience treating his own injuries in the wilderness. He packed the wound with clean cotton cloth, applying steady pressure while mentally calculating blood loss and the time Margaret could survive without proper surgical care. Her pulse was rapid but still strong, suggesting her body was fighting to compensate for the trauma. But the pallor of her skin and the cold sweat beading on her forehead told a different story. She was going into shock. Working quickly, Gus cleared debris from around her body and positioned her on her side to better access both wounds. The second arrow remained embedded near her right shoulder blade, its shaft rising and falling slightly with each breath. The positioning was actually fortunate. If the point had penetrated much deeper, it would have punctured her lung or damaged major blood vessels. As he worked, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever making her delirious. In her lucid moments, she spoke in fragments that revealed pieces of her identity and mission. "The children," she whispered during one brief awakening. "We were going to teach the children, both sides, white and Cheyenne, together. Father said education was the only bridge." Gus paused in his preparations. "Your father was Reverend Sinclair?" "Reverend James Sinclair, yes, from the Presbyterian Mission Board in Denver." Her voice carried pride mixed with grief. "We carried letters of introduction from the territorial governor. The Cheyenne Council had agreed to meet with us." Something about her words didn't align with what Gus had observed at the attack site. The violence had been too targeted, too personal for a simple rejection of missionary overtures. Cheyenne war parties didn't typically use ceremonial arrows against random travelers. Such weapons were reserved for specific enemies, people who had committed particular offenses against the tribe. But questioning Margaret about discrepancies in her story would have to wait. Right now, her survival depended entirely on his ability to remove the second arrow without causing fatal damage. Gus sterilized his knife blade with whiskey, then took a careful swig himself. The alcohol burned, but it steadied his nerves. "Margaret," he said softly, checking that she was conscious, "I need to remove the second arrow now. It's going to hurt terribly, but I need you to stay as still as possible." She nodded weakly, her honey-colored eyes meeting his with remarkable trust. "I understand. Do what you must." Gus positioned his hands around the arrow shaft, feeling for the angle of penetration. This one had gone in at a sharper angle than the first, which might mean less damage to vital organs, but greater difficulty in removal. The barbed point would have to be worked free carefully to avoid tearing major blood vessels. As he began to apply pressure, Margaret's scream pierced the desert air. Birds exploded from nearby rocks, and Gus found himself praying to a god he hadn't spoken to since Molly's death. The arrow resisted, its barbed point caught in muscle and possibly bone. Each incremental movement brought fresh agony for Margaret and growing terror for Gus. When the second arrow finally came free, Gus felt a moment of pure relief. This point was smaller than the first, and while barbed, it had caused less tissue damage during removal. The bleeding was manageable, serious, but not immediately fatal. Margaret had lost consciousness again, which was actually a mercy given the pain she had endured. Working by firelight as the sun set behind the mesa walls, Gus cleaned both wounds with whiskey and began the delicate process of suturing. His stitches were small and precise, the result of years treating his own injuries and occasionally helping injured animals. But this was different. Human flesh required different techniques, and Margaret's life hung in the balance of his skill. As he worked, memories of Molly flooded back unbidden. She had always been fascinated by his medical supplies, asking endless questions about the purpose of each instrument. During their travels, she would help him gather medicinal plants, learning to identify willow bark for pain relief and yarrow for bleeding wounds. If she had lived, she might have become a nurse or even a doctor. Such ambitions weren't unheard of for determined women on the frontier. The parallel between Margaret and his lost daughter was unsettling. Both were young women far from home. Both had been placed in his care during moments of crisis. The difference was that this time he was present. This time he could act instead of arriving too late with useless regrets. By midnight, Gus had finished suturing both wounds and applied poultices of golden seal and comfrey to fight infection. Margaret's fever remained high, but her breathing had stabilized and the bleeding had stopped. He built a small fire in the shelter of the overturned wagon, close enough to provide warmth but positioned to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The location made him nervous. Whatever had motivated the attack on the wagon train might still pose a threat, and he was now vulnerable while caring for an injured woman. His pack horse was secured nearby, loaded with supplies and ready for quick departure if necessary. His rifle remained within easy reach, loaded and primed. During the long hours of the night, Margaret alternated between fevered sleep and brief periods of consciousness. In her delirium, she spoke of her father's mission, her own hopes for bridging the cultural divide between settlers and native tribes. She mentioned specific names: Running Wolf, the Cheyenne chief, Colonel Harrison at Fort Collins, and someone called the Interpreter, who had arranged the initial contacts. Some of these names were familiar to Gus from his military service, but the connections remained unclear. What was clear was that Margaret and her father had been involved in something more complex than simple missionary work. The presence of surveying equipment and official documents among the wagon train's debris suggested governmental involvement. As dawn approached, Gus found himself studying Margaret's face in the firelight. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with the kind of determined features that suggested strong character. Even unconscious and fevered, she maintained an air of dignity that spoke well of her upbringing. More importantly, she was alive. Against all medical odds and his own expectations, his decision to remove the arrows had succeeded. The wounds were clean, showing no signs of infection beyond what was normal for such trauma. Her pulse remained steady, and her breathing had improved throughout the night. For the first time in 15 years, Gus McReynolds had acted decisively in a medical crisis, and his patient had survived. The realization brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, pride, and the terrifying knowledge that he was once again responsible for another human life. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Margaret stirred and opened her eyes. They were clearer now, more focused, though still bright with fever. "You saved me," she said simply. Gus shook his head. "You're not saved yet. The real danger is infection, and we're 3 days from the nearest doctor." "Then we'd better get started," Margaret said, attempting to sit up before the pain forced her back down. "Unless you plan to carry me." Despite everything, Gus found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he had experienced in longer than he could remember. This young woman possessed remarkable spirit. Perhaps, with careful nursing and favorable weather, she might actually survive the journey to proper medical care. But first, they had to survive whatever dangers had destroyed her wagon train, dangers that might still be hunting for survivors in the unforgiving landscape around them. Margaret's condition worsened as the second day progressed. Despite Gus's careful ministrations, infection began to take hold in both wounds. Dark red streaks radiated outward from the suture lines, and her fever spiked dangerously high. By afternoon, she was delirious, speaking in fragments about her father's mission and the children she had hoped to teach. Gus maintained a constant vigil beside her makeshift bed, using cool water to bring down the fever and willow bark tea to ease her pain. Every few hours, he changed the dressings on her wounds, applying fresh poultices of golden seal and checking for signs of gangrene. The infection was spreading, but slowly, a sign that her body was fighting back with remarkable resilience. During her lucid moments, Margaret revealed more details about the wagon train's true purpose. Her father, Reverend James Sinclair, had indeed been commissioned by the Presbyterian Mission Board to establish a school for native children. But the mission carried additional weight. Territorial authorities had specifically requested that he gather information about tribal movements and attitudes toward the recent treaties. "Father believed we could serve both purposes," Margaret explained during one clear interval. "Genuine education for the children, but also intelligence that might prevent future conflicts." He thought understanding could replace suspicion. Gus kept his expression neutral, but internally he felt a familiar chill. Such dual-purpose missions rarely ended well for anyone involved. Native tribes were expert at detecting deception, and the consequences for discovered spies were typically severe. The attack on the wagon train was beginning to make more sense. As evening approached, Margaret's fever broke briefly, leaving her exhausted but coherent. She noticed the small leather Bible that Gus kept close at hand, Molly's Bible, worn smooth by 15 years of handling. "Was she very young?" Margaret asked softly. Gus didn't need to ask who she meant. 8 years old, bright as a new penny, curious about everything. "She would have liked you. You both asked the same kinds of questions." "What kinds of questions?" "The difficult ones, the ones that make adults think harder than they want to." Gus smoothed the Bible's cover with his thumb, a gesture that had become unconscious over the years. "Molly once asked me why God let children get sick if he loved them so much. I never found a good answer." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of firelight across his weathered features. "Perhaps the answer isn't about God's love, but about our responsibility to each other. Maybe we're supposed to be the answer to each other's prayers." The words hit Gus with unexpected force. For 15 years, he had carried his guilt like a stone, believing that his failure to save Molly proved his fundamental inadequacy as a protector. But Margaret's perspective offered a different interpretation, that perhaps his presence here, now, was itself a form of answered prayer. During the long hours of the night, Margaret's delirium returned with greater intensity. She spoke about the attack on the wagon train, reliving memories that came in disconnected fragments. Through her fevered recounting, Gus began to piece together what had actually happened. The wagon train had been approaching a prearranged meeting point with Chief Running Wolf's band when they were overtaken by a different group of Cheyenne warriors. These weren't the peaceful faction that had agreed to the educational mission. They were war chiefs who viewed any cooperation with white authorities as betrayal of their people. "They knew," Margaret whispered in her delirium. "They knew about Father's reports to the territorial government. Someone told them about the intelligence gathering." The war chief, his face was painted with black stripes. He spoke perfect English. He said we were spies, disguised as missionaries. Gus felt his blood run cold. If the attack had been motivated by discovered espionage rather than random violence, it meant the perpetrators might return to ensure no witnesses survived. Margaret's presence at the attack site made her a liability that some might not risk leaving alive. As dawn approached, Gus made a crucial decision. Margaret needed proper medical care, but attempting to transport her immediately might kill her. The infection required several more days of intensive treatment before she would be stable enough for travel. But staying at the attack site exposed them both to potential discovery by hostile forces. He had noticed a defensive position about 2 miles northwest, a natural fortress of red sandstone with multiple escape routes and a reliable water source. If they could reach it, he could establish a proper camp where Margaret could recover while he kept watch for potential threats. "Margaret," he said gently, checking that she was conscious, "we need to move to a safer location. It's going to be difficult, but staying here is too dangerous." She nodded weakly, understanding the necessity despite her condition. "I can ride if you help me." The journey to the sandstone refuge took most of the morning. Gus had fashioned a travois from wagon debris, allowing Belle to drag Margaret while he walked alongside, ready to provide support or protection as needed. Every jolt brought gasps of pain from his patient, but she endured the trip with remarkable fortitude. The new campsite proved ideal for their purposes. A natural overhang provided shelter from sun and potential rain, while the elevated position offered excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain. A spring emerged from the rock face, providing clean water for drinking and medical care. Most importantly, the location was defensible, accessible by only one narrow path that could be easily watched. Over the following days, Margaret's condition gradually stabilized. The infection began to recede under Gus's careful treatment, and her fever finally broke completely. But recovery brought new challenges, as she became strong enough to ask difficult questions about their situation and future plans. "You're not just a mountain hermit," she observed during one of their conversations. "Your medical knowledge is too sophisticated, your equipment too professional. Who were you before you disappeared into these mountains?" Gus found himself reluctant to discuss his military service, but Margaret's direct gaze demanded honesty. "I was a cavalry scout for 15 years. Medical training was part of the job. You learn to treat injuries when the nearest doctor is weeks away." "And you left the military after your daughter died?" "I left because I became something I didn't recognize." The admission came out more forcefully than he intended. "I made choices that led to innocent people dying. After Molly's death, I couldn't pretend those choices were justified by duty or necessity." Margaret studied his face with those perceptive, honey-colored eyes. "What kind of choices?" Gus was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that had become their evening companion. Finally, he reached into his pack and withdrew a faded blue hair ribbon, Molly's hair ribbon, the last physical reminder he had of his daughter. "The kind that haunt a man for the rest of his life," he said simply. "The kind that make him question whether he deserves forgiveness from God or anyone else." Margaret reached out and gently touched the ribbon, understanding its significance without needing explanation. "Perhaps forgiveness isn't something we deserve, but something we choose to give and receive. Perhaps that's what makes us human." As the days passed and Margaret grew stronger, Gus found himself drawn into conversations that challenged assumptions he had held for 15 years. Her faith wasn't the simple acceptance he expected from a missionary's daughter, but a complex understanding of mercy, justice, and personal responsibility that forced him to examine his own beliefs. For the first time since Molly's death, Augustus McReynolds began to consider the possibility that redemption might be something more than a beautiful impossibility, that it might be a choice available to anyone willing to risk caring about someone other than themselves. By the end of their first week in the sandstone refuge, Margaret had recovered enough to sit upright for extended periods and take short walks around their camp. Her wounds were healing cleanly, though she would carry scars for the rest of her in life. More importantly, the fever had broken completely, and her natural strength was reasserting itself. It was during one of these conversations, as they shared an evening meal of rabbit stew and wild onions, that Margaret revealed the full scope of her father's mission. The story she told painted a picture far more complex than simple missionary work. Father believed that education was the key to preventing future conflicts. She began, her voice steady despite the painful memories. But the territorial authorities had convinced him that gathering intelligence was equally important for protecting both communities. Gus set down his coffee cup, recognizing the familiar justifications. Intelligence gathering has a way of becoming the primary mission, regardless of original intentions. "That's what I feared," Margaret admitted. "As we traveled toward the meeting point with Chief Running Wolf's band, I noticed Father spending more time writing in his journal and less time preparing lessons for the children. When I asked about it, he said he was documenting cultural observations that might help future missionaries." She paused, staring into the fire with an expression of deep sadness. "I found his real reports 3 days before the attack. He was providing detailed information about tribal numbers, weapon stockpiles, potential defensive positions, everything a military commander would need to plan an assault. The revelation explained much about the attack's ferocity. Cheyenne justice was swift and merciless for those who violated trust, especially under the guise of peaceful intentions. That Margaret had survived at all suggested either remarkable luck or deliberate decision by the war party to leave a witness. "Did you confront your father about the reports?" Gus asked gently. "Yes, the night before we were attacked." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He admitted everything, said the mission board had made intelligence gathering condition of their support. He justified it by saying the information would help prevent misunderstandings that could lead to larger conflicts." Gus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sick feeling he had experienced during his own military service, when duty and conscience collided. "What did you tell him?" "That deception was the worst possible foundation for building trust between our peoples. That if we couldn't approach the Cheyenne with complete honesty, we had no right to approach them at all." Tears reflected the firelight as they traced down her cheeks. "Our last conversation was an argument. He died believing I thought he was a traitor." The weight of that guilt was something Gus understood intimately. His own last conversation with Molly had been a hurried goodbye as he departed for his final scouting mission. He had promised to bring her a special present from the trading post, a promise that would never be fulfilled. "Guilt over final words is one of grief's cruelest torments," he said softly. "But your father knew you loved him, even when you disagreed with his choices. Love doesn't require agreement. Sometimes it requires the courage to speak difficult truths." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "You sound like someone who has given this considerable thought." 15 years of consideration," Gus admitted. 15 years of wishing I had said different words, made different choices. But all the wishing in the world can't change the past. All we can do is try to honor our loved ones by living better than we did before." Over the following days, their conversations deepened as Margaret's strength continued to return. She possessed a curious mind that reminded Gus powerfully of his daughter's endless questions. But where Molly's inquiries had been those of a child discovering the world, Margaret's came from someone who had already seen enough of life to understand its complexities. She was particularly interested in his knowledge of Native American customs and languages, skills he had acquired during his years as a cavalry scout. Gus found himself sharing stories of his interactions with various tribes. The friendships he had formed before politics and broken treaties poisoned those relationships. "Chief Running Wolf is a reasonable man," Gus explained one evening as they watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. "I worked with him during the treaty negotiations 5 years ago. He genuinely wanted peace, but he's been betrayed too many times to trust easily." "Do you think he ordered the attack on our wagon train?" Margaret asked. Gus shook his head. Running Wolf wouldn't use the kind of ceremonial arrows that were found at the attack site. Those were war arrows, used by younger chiefs who believe violence is the only language white authorities understand. Someone like Crowfeather or Black Hawk warriors who view any cooperation with settlers as weakness. The distinction was important because it suggested that not all Cheyenne factions were united in hostility toward Margaret's educational mission. If they could somehow reach Running Wolf's band, there might still be a possibility of fulfilling her father's original vision, a school that served both communities without the taint of espionage. But such a possibility would require courage that Gus wasn't certain he possessed. Approaching any Cheyenne band carried enormous risks, especially for someone with his military background. His own past betrayals made him a marked man among tribes that valued honor above all other virtues. It was on their 10th day in the refuge that they spotted the smoke signals. Thin columns rose from 3 different points on the horizon, 2 precisely positioned to be random campfires. Someone was coordinating movement across a wide area, using traditional communication methods that suggested Native American involvement. "Are they looking for survivors from the wagon train?" Margaret asked, watching the signals through Gus's spyglass. "Possibly, or they might be responding to reports of strangers in the area." Gus studied the pattern of signals, trying to decode their meaning. His knowledge of Cheyenne communication was limited, but the urgency of the exchanges was unmistakable. That night, as they maintained a cold camp to avoid detection, Margaret made a proposal that caught Gus completely off guard. "I want to complete my father's mission," she said quietly. "The real mission, establishing a school for Native children. But I want to do it honestly, without any connection to military or territorial authorities." Gus stared at her in the darkness, wondering if her head injury had affected her judgment. "Margaret, you barely survived your last encounter with the Cheyenne. What makes you think they would trust you now?" "Because I have something my father didn't have," she replied with quiet conviction. "I have proof of the deception. The fragment of treaty document that survived the fire, it shows the broken promises that led to the attack. If I can present that evidence to Chief Running Wolf, along with a genuine offer of educational cooperation, it might be enough to start building real trust." The fragment she referred to was a partially burned piece of paper they had discovered among the wagon debris. It contained portions of territorial correspondence that revealed the intelligence-gathering mission, evidence that would vindicate Cheyenne's suspicions about the missionary expedition. "Even if Running Wolf believed your intentions," Gus said carefully, "approaching his band would be extraordinarily dangerous. You're still recovering from serious injuries, and my presence would complicate any negotiations." Margaret turned to face him in the darkness, her voice carrying the same determined tone he had heard when she begged him not to remove the arrows. "Then, help me find another way. You know this country, understand both cultures. If there's any possibility of turning this tragedy into something meaningful, don't you owe it to your daughter's memory to try?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge, forcing Gus to confront a truth he had been avoiding. For 15 years, he had hidden from the world, using grief as an excuse for inaction. But Margaret's presence had awakened something he thought was permanently buried, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. As he considered her proposal, Gus realized that his choice would define not just their immediate future, but the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. He could return to his mountain sanctuary, carrying the guilt of another lost opportunity. Or he could risk everything on the possibility that redemption was still possible, even for someone who had failed as catastrophically as he had. The decision, when it came, felt both terrifying and inevitable. The morning after Margaret's proposal, Gus made a discovery that changed everything. While checking her father's belongings more thoroughly, searching for anything that might support their mission to the Cheyenne, he found a carefully wrapped bundle hidden in the false bottom of a travel chest. Inside was an object that took his breath away, a sacred peace pipe, intricately carved from red pipestone and decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork. "Margaret," he called softly, unwrapping the pipe with reverent hands, "you need to see this." She moved carefully to where he knelt, her healing wounds still limiting her mobility. When she saw the pipe, her eyes widened with recognition and wonder. "Father mentioned this," she whispered. "It was a gift from the territorial governor, meant to be presented to Chief Running Wolf as a symbol of peaceful intentions. I thought it had been destroyed in the attack." Gus examined the pipe more closely, his pulse quickening as he recognized specific details of its pipe construction. The carving style, the particular arrangement of feathers, the distinctive beadwork pattern. This wasn't just any ceremonial pipe. This was a sacred calumet, the kind used in the most solemn treaty negotiations. "This changes everything," he said, his voice tight with possibility and apprehension. "A pipe like this carries enormous significance if we could present it to Running Wolf properly, with the right protocols. It might be enough to overcome their suspicions about Father's true mission." Margaret finished, understanding immediately. But would they trust us to carry such a sacred object? Wouldn't they suspect it was stolen or tainted by the deception? Gus was quiet for a long moment, turning the pipe in his hands while memories flooded back. Years ago, he had witnessed a pipe ceremony between Running Wolf and territorial officials. The rituals surrounding such objects were complex, requiring specific words, gestures, and offerings. More importantly, the pipe could only be presented by someone who understood its spiritual significance and approached with genuine respect. "There's something else," he said finally. 3 days before your father's wagon train was attacked, I saw smoke signals that I didn't understand at the time. But thinking back, they might have been from Running Wolf's band, trying to warn your expedition about the war party that eventually attacked you. Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. You think Running Wolf tried to prevent the attack? It's possible. If he had agreed to meet with your father, he would have felt responsible for ensuring safe passage. The attack by Crow Feather's warriors would have been seen as a violation of Running Wolf's authority. The implications were staggering. If Running Wolf had indeed tried to protect the missionary expedition, he might view the peace pipe not as a tainted offering, but as a sacred trust that had survived despite the tragedy. Presenting it properly could demonstrate respect for both the object's spiritual significance and Running Wolf's efforts to maintain peace. But such a presentation would require approaching the Cheyenne camp directly, a prospect that filled Gus with equal measures of hope and terror. His past betrayals made him a marked man among many native tribes. Even if Running Wolf was willing to listen, other warriors might demand immediate justice for his role in previous treaty violations. Their deliberations were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Gus grabbed his rifle and moved to the defensive position he had prepared, while Margaret retreated deeper into the shelter of the overhang. 3 riders emerged from the canyon below, moving with the confident ease of men who knew the terrain intimately. Cheyenne warriors. Gus recognized the lead rider immediately, Running Wolf himself, distinguished by the distinctive white and black paint patterns that marked his status as a peace chief. The 2 warriors accompanying him were younger, their postures alert but not overtly hostile. Their weapons remained holstered, a sign that they came for conversation rather than combat. Augustus McReynolds, Running Wolf called out, his English heavily accented but clear. "I know you are there. We need to speak." The fact that Running Wolf knew his location and identity was both surprising and alarming. It suggested the Cheyenne had been tracking them for days, watching their movements from concealment. The question was whether this visit represented opportunity or mortal danger. Gus stepped into view, his rifle lowered but ready. "Chief Running Wolf, you honor us with your presence." The Cheyenne leader dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. Despite being in his 50s, Running Wolf moved with the fluid grace of a natural warrior. His face bore the weathered dignity of someone who had seen too much violence, but still hoped for peace. "You carry a wounded woman," Running Wolf said, his dark eyes taking in Margaret's presence behind the rocks. The daughter of the spy who came to deceive us." The directness of the accusation left no room for evasion. Gus felt Margaret tense behind him, but he forced himself to remain calm. This moment would determine whether they lived or died, whether Margaret's mission could continue or would end in the same violence that had claimed her father. Her father was indeed gathering intelligence, Gus admitted, but his daughter opposed that deception. She came here seeking to build genuine trust between our peoples. Running Wolf studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And you, Augustus McReynolds, what do you seek? You who helped Colonel Harrison betray the Treaty of 55? You who provided false information that led to the deaths of 3 families?" The accusation hit Gus like a physical blow, but he had been expecting it. His role in the treaty betrayals was well known among the tribes, a stain on his reputation that no amount of time could erase. "I seek redemption for past failures," he said simply. I seek to help this woman fulfill her father's original vision, a school that serves all children, built on honesty rather than deception. Running Wolf's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of surprise. You would risk your life to help her succeed where her father failed? I would, and I offer proof of my sincerity. Gus carefully withdrew the peace pipe from its wrapping, holding it reverently in both hands. This was meant for you. It survived the attack on the wagon train, as did the woman who wishes to present it properly. The effect on Running Wolf was immediate and profound. His eyes widened as he recognized the sacred object, and he took an involuntary step backward. The two warriors behind him murmured in their own language, their voices carrying notes of awe and confusion. "Where did you find this?" Running Wolf asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Among Reverend Sinclair's belongings," Margaret said, stepping forward despite her injuries. "My father carried it as a gift from the territorial governor, but I know now that it represents something more important than political negotiation. It represents the possibility of genuine peace between our peoples." Running Wolf was silent for a long time, his gaze moving between the pipe, Margaret's scarred face, and Gus's weathered features. Finally, he spoke in Cheyenne to his companions, a rapid exchange that Gus couldn't follow completely, but which seemed to involve debate about trust and honor. "You understand the significance of what you offer?" Running Wolf asked Margaret directly. "I'm beginning to," she replied with quiet dignity. "I understand that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. But I also understand that some things are worth the attempt, regardless of the risk." The Cheyenne chief nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had been hoping to hear. "If you truly wish to present this pipe according to our customs, you must come to our camp. You must participate in ceremonies that will test your sincerity. And you must accept that some of my warriors still demand justice for past betrayals." He looked directly at Gus as he spoke the last words, making clear that the greatest danger would fall on the man who had already proven capable of deception. "I understand," Gus said, "and I accept those terms." Margaret stepped closer to him, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of support. "We both accept." Running Wolf studied them for another long moment, then nodded once. 3 days. We will send a guide to bring you to our camp. Use that time to prepare yourselves spiritually for what is to come. The pipe ceremony cannot be performed lightly, and the consequences of failure are severe for all involved. As the 3 Cheyenne riders disappeared back into the canyon, Gus felt the weight of their commitment settle over him like a heavy cloak. In 3 days, he would face the judgment of people he had wronged, carrying the hopes of a young woman whose faith in redemption might cost them both their lives. But for the first time in 15 years, Augustus McReynolds was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The sensation was both terrifying and strangely liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump rather than fall. While preparing for their journey to Running Wolf's camp, Gus made a discovery that shattered everything they thought they understood about Margaret's father and his mission. He was carefully inventorying the Reverend's belongings, looking for anything that might help or hinder their upcoming negotiations, when his fingers found a hidden compartment in the bottom of Sinclair's journal case. Inside were official military documents bearing the seal of the United States Army. As Gus read through the papers by firelight, his blood ran cold. These weren't simple intelligence-gathering instructions. They were detailed military orders outlining a comprehensive espionage operation against the Cheyenne Nation. "Margaret," he called quietly, his voice tight with apprehension, "you need to see this." She moved to his side, still favoring her injured back, but moving with increasing strength. When she saw the documents spread before him, her face went pale in the firelight. The papers revealed a systematic deception that went far beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Her father hadn't simply agreed to gather intelligence as a condition of mission board support. He had been a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Intelligence Service, operating under deep cover for over 2 years. Captain James Sinclair, Margaret read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Detailed to Special Operations Division, Department of the Missouri. Her hands shook as she held the commission document. This isn't possible. Father was a minister. He performed my confirmation, baptized children in our congregation. He was both, Gus said gently, reading through the operational orders. According to these documents, he maintained his ministerial credentials while serving as an intelligence officer. The missionary work provided perfect cover for gathering information about tribal movements, defensive positions, and political divisions within Cheyenne leadership. But the revelations grew worse as they read deeper into the files. The educational mission Margaret believed in so deeply had never been intended as genuine outreach. It was designed as an intelligence-gathering operation, targeting Cheyenne children and families. The school would have provided unprecedented access to tribal internal affairs, family structures, and cultural vulnerabilities. The children, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. He was going to use the children as sources of information about their families, their traditions, their weaknesses. One document particularly chilled Gus, a detailed psychological profile of Chief Running Wolf, compiled from multiple sources and recommending specific approaches for manipulation. The file described the chief's genuine desire for peace as an exploitable weakness, suggesting ways to use his honor against him in future negotiations. Most damning of all was a map showing planned military positions for a coordinated assault on Cheyenne winter camps. The intelligence Sinclair had been gathering was intended to support a campaign designed to drive the tribe from their traditional lands entirely, clearing the way for expanded mining operations in the Colorado Territory. My God, Margaret breathed, staring at the tactical maps. How many people were involved in this deception? How long had they been planning? She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes focusing on a familiar name at the bottom of one document. Colonel William Harrison, the same officer who had worked with Gus during the treaty negotiations 5 years earlier. The signature was unmistakable, as was the connection to Gus's own past betrayals. "You know him," Margaret said, not a question but a statement. "This Colonel Harrison, he's the one who ordered you to provide false information during the treaty negotiations." Gus nodded grimly. "He was my commanding officer during those negotiations. The man who convinced me that small betrayals were necessary to prevent larger conflicts." The irony was bitter. He had fled his military service to escape such moral compromises, only to discover that his current situation was connected to the same corrupt system. But there was more. Hidden among the intelligence reports was a document that made Gus's heart stop. Detailed information about his own background, his 15-year self-imposed exile, and his psychological vulnerabilities. The army had been tracking him, studying him, preparing to use him if the opportunity arose. "They knew," he said, his voice hollow with realization. "They knew I was in these mountains. They knew about Molly, about my guilt over failing to save her. If necessary, they planned to manipulate me into participating in their operation." Margaret stared at him in horror. "How?" "By presenting me with exactly the situation I face now, a young woman in desperate need of medical care, injured in a way that would remind me of my daughter's death. They understood that my guilt would make me vulnerable to anyone who needed saving. The revelation cast their entire relationship in a new and troubling light. Had their meeting been orchestrated? Was Margaret's presence at the attack site somehow arranged? The paranoid logic of intelligence operations suggested that nothing happened by pure chance. But as Gus studied Margaret's face in the firelight, seeing her genuine shock and horror at these revelations, he found himself certain of one thing: whatever manipulation might have brought them together, her emotions and intentions were real. Her father might have been a spy, but she was exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman who genuinely believed in the possibility of peace between cultures. "I need to know," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I need to know if anything my father told me was true, if any part of our mission was genuine." They spent the rest of the night reading through every document, piecing together the full scope of the deception. What emerged was a portrait of a man caught between competing loyalties, a genuine minister who had been recruited into intelligence work through a combination of patriotic duty and financial pressure. Several personal letters revealed Sinclair's growing discomfort with his role. In correspondence with his military handlers, he had repeatedly requested reassignment, expressing concerns about the ethical implications of using religious mission work as cover for espionage. His requests had been denied, with increasing pressure applied to ensure his compliance. He tried to quit, Margaret said, holding one particularly anguished letter. 6 months ago, he wrote to Colonel Harrison asking to be relieved of his intelligence duties. He wanted to focus solely on the educational mission. But they wouldn't let him, Gus observed, reading Harrison's response. They threatened to expose his intelligence work to the mission board, which would have ended his ministerial career and destroyed his reputation. The final piece of the puzzle came in a coded message dated just 1 week before the wagon train's departure. Harrison had ordered Sinclair to accelerate his intelligence gathering, hinting at an imminent military operation that would require detailed knowledge of Cheyenne defensive positions. The pressure to produce results had become intense. "The attack on our wagon train," Margaret said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "It wasn't random violence or even retaliation for broken treaties. It was specifically targeting a known intelligence operation." Gus nodded. "Someone discovered your father's true mission and decided to eliminate the threat. But the question is, who and how much do they know about our current situation?" The implications were staggering. If Cheyenne war chiefs like Crow Feather had discovered the intelligence operation, they might view any survivors as continued threats. Margaret's very existence could be seen as evidence that the espionage network remained active. More troubling still was the possibility that Colonel Harrison and his military allies might be tracking Margaret, hoping to recover sensitive documents or eliminate witnesses to their illegal operations. Military intelligence officers didn't typically allow such operations to be exposed without consequences. "We can't go to Running Wolf's camp," Gus said finally. "Not with this information. Even if he's willing to listen, other Cheyenne leaders will view us as confirmed spies. The peace pipe ceremony would become a trap." But Margaret shook her head with surprising firmness. "No, this changes nothing about what we need to do. If anything, it makes our mission more important." "How can you say that?" "Your father's deception validates every suspicion the Cheyenne have about white intentions." "Exactly," Margaret interrupted, "which is why someone needs to tell them the truth. Someone needs to present evidence of the deception and prove that not everyone is part of it." She gestured to the scattered documents. "These papers prove that the intelligence operation existed. They also prove that some people opposed it." Gus stared at her, recognizing the same dangerous idealism that had driven her father and that had gotten him killed. "Margaret, presenting this evidence could get us both executed as spies, or it could prove that we're the ones telling the truth," she replied with quiet conviction. "Running Wolf is an intelligent man. He'll understand the significance of someone voluntarily revealing such damaging information. It's the kind of gesture that could begin rebuilding trust." As dawn approached, Gus found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. Margaret's plan was either brilliantly courageous or suicidally naive, possibly both. But her reasoning contained an undeniable logic. Running Wolf had already shown surprising willingness to listen. Approaching him with complete honesty, no matter how damaging, might indeed prove their sincerity. The alternative was to flee back to his mountain sanctuary, abandoning Margaret's mission and carrying the weight of another failure. But 15 years of guilt had taught him that running from difficult choices only made them heavier. "If we do this," he said finally, "we go knowing we might not survive. The Cheyenne have every right to demand justice for the deception your father participated in." Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I understand, but some things are worth the risk. If there's any chance of preventing future violence, of building the genuine peace my father only pretended to seek, we have to try." As they prepared for what might be their final day of freedom, Gus reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. He had spent 15 years avoiding responsibility for others' lives, only to find himself committed to a mission that could cost both their lives. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps redemption required exactly this kind of risk, the willingness to stake everything on the possibility that truth could triumph over deception, that courage could overcome past failures. In 3 hours, Running Wolf's guide would arrive to escort them to the Cheyenne camp. They would go carrying evidence of their own people's betrayal, hoping that honesty might succeed where deception had failed so catastrophically. It was either the bravest thing Gus had ever done, or the most foolish. Time would tell which. The Cheyenne guide arrived precisely at dawn, materializing from the canyon shadows like a spirit given form. He was a young warrior named Swift Arrow, his face painted with the geometric patterns that indicated a messenger's role. Without speaking, he gestured for them to follow, his dark eyes taking in their travel preparations with professional assessment. Gus had packed carefully for this journey, knowing it might be his last. In addition to the military documents and the sacred peace pipe, he carried Molly's wooden cross, the hand-carved grave marker he had made 15 years ago but never placed on her burial site. The cross represented everything he had failed to do for his daughter, but perhaps it could serve as a reminder of what he hoped to accomplish for Margaret. The ride to Running Wolf's camp took most of the day, following hidden trails that wound through maze-like canyons and across wind-swept mesas. Swift Arrow set a steady pace that accommodated Margaret's still healing injuries, while making clear that delays would not be tolerated. His silence was absolute, responding to questions with hand gestures when response was necessary at all. As they traveled, Gus found himself studying the landscape with new appreciation. These mountains and canyons had been his refuge for 15 years, but now he was seeing them through different eyes, not as a place to hide from the world, but as sacred ground where different peoples had struggled to coexist for generations. The thought that his actions might contribute to either peace or further violence in this place filled him with both hope and terror. Margaret rode with remarkable composure, despite the pain that crossing rough terrain brought to her healing wounds. Her father's military documents were secured in her saddlebags, along with personal letters that revealed his growing discomfort with his intelligence role. She had insisted on carrying these papers herself, accepting full responsibility for whatever consequences their revelation might bring. "Are you certain about this?" Gus asked during one of their brief rest stops. "Once we present those documents, there's no taking back what they reveal." "I've been certain since the moment I found them," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "My father lived a lie that contributed to violence between our peoples. The least I can do is tell the truth, regardless of what it costs me personally." Her courage was humbling. Gus had spent 15 years paralyzed by guilt over past failures, while this young woman was actively choosing to risk everything for the possibility of redemption. The contrast made him question every choice he had made since Molly's death. By late afternoon, they reached the Cheyenne camp, a collection of tipis arranged in traditional patterns along a stream that wound through a protected valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children played between the lodges while their mothers worked at various tasks. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that made the impending confrontation seem surreal. But Gus's military experience allowed him to see beyond the surface tranquility. Warriors were positioned at strategic points around the camp's perimeter, their weapons readily accessible despite their casual postures. This was a people prepared for war, maintaining the appearance of normal life while ready to defend themselves at a moment's notice. Running Wolf emerged from the largest teepee as they approached, accompanied by several other men whose bearing marked them as tribal elders or war chiefs. Gus recognized the lean figure of Crow Feather, among them the war chief, whose warriors had likely carried out the attack on Margaret's wagon train. The man's presence suggested that this gathering would involve more than simple diplomacy. Augustus McReynolds, Running Wolf said, formally, his English careful and precise. Margaret Sinclair, you come bearing sacred objects and dangerous knowledge. We will hear what you have to say, but know that some among us demand immediate justice for past betrayals. Crowfeather stepped forward, his face painted with the black stripes that indicated a warrior's readiness for battle. He spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, his tone leaving no doubt about his feelings regarding their presence. Swift Arrow translated quietly for Margaret's benefit. He says that the white man's words have brought only death and broken promises. He questions why we should listen to more lies from those who have already proven their treachery. Margaret dismounted carefully, her movements deliberate and respectful, despite the obvious pain. I don't ask you to trust my words, she said, addressing Crowfeather directly. I ask only that you examine the evidence I carry. Judge for yourselves whether I speak truth or continue the deceptions of my father. Running Wolf studied her face intently, as if searching for signs of the same duplicity that had characterized her father's mission. What evidence do you offer? Proof of my father's true mission, Margaret replied, retrieving the military documents from her saddlebags, orders from Colonel Harrison detailing the intelligence operation your people suspected, maps showing planned military strikes against your winter camps, everything you need to understand the scope of the deception. The effect of her words on the assembled Cheyenne was immediate and profound. Several warriors reached instinctively for their weapons, while the elders exchanged rapid comments in their native language. That a white woman would voluntarily reveal such damaging information was clearly beyond their experience. Crowfeather spoke again, his voice harsh with suspicion. Swift Arrow translated, he asks why you would reveal information that proves your father's guilt. He wonders if this is another trick designed to make us believe in your honesty while hiding deeper deceptions. It was Gus who answered, stepping forward with the wooden cross clutched in his hands. Because some truths are worth dying for, he said simply. Because the only way to break cycles of deception is to choose honesty, even when it's dangerous. He held up the cross, its simple carving catching the late afternoon sunlight. This belonged to my daughter, who died 15 years ago while I was away on military duty. I failed her because I prioritized orders over family, duty over love. I won't make that mistake again. Running Wolf's eyes fixed on the cross, understanding its significance without needing explanation. You offer this as proof of your sincerity? I offer it as proof that some losses teach us the value of what we're fighting to protect, Gus replied. Margaret Sinclair represents the hope for genuine peace that her father only pretended to seek. If my presence here endangers that hope, I'll accept whatever justice you deem appropriate. For several long minutes, the camp was silent except for the sound of wind through the cottonwood trees and the distant laughter of children. Running Wolf conferred quietly with the other elders, their discussion too rapid and complex for Gus to follow, even with his limited knowledge of Cheyenne. Finally, Running Wolf spoke. We will examine your evidence in council tonight. If you speak truth, it changes much about how we understand recent events. If you lie... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As evening approached, Gus and Margaret were escorted to a small tepee at the edge of the camp, guarded but not imprisoned. The arrangement suggested cautious hospitality rather than open hostility, a promising sign given the circumstances. Whatever happens tonight, Margaret said as they prepared for the council meeting, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. You didn't have to help me, and you certainly didn't have to risk coming here. Gus was quiet for a moment, thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this point. 15 years ago, I failed to save my daughter because I wasn't there when she needed me. Tonight, I have the chance to help save something she would have valued, the possibility of peace between peoples who have suffered too much from misunderstanding and deception. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Gus of Molly's favorite colors, They heard the sound of drums beginning in the center of camp. The council was gathering, and their fate would soon be decided. The sacred peace pipe ceremony would determine whether Margaret's vision of genuine cooperation could survive the legacy of her father's deception. More personally, it would test whether Augustus McReynolds had truly found the courage to risk everything for someone else's welfare, or whether 15 years of guilt had simply driven him toward a more spectacular form of failure. As they walked toward the council fire, Gus reflected on the irony of their situation. He had spent his entire adult life serving institutions, the army, the territorial government, even his own grief that demanded compromise with his deepest values. Tonight, for perhaps the first time, he was acting in accordance with his conscience rather than his obligations. The result might be disaster, but at least it would be an honest disaster, chosen freely rather than imposed by circumstances beyond his control. For a man who had lived 15 years with the weight of involuntary failure, the prospect of voluntary sacrifice carried a strange kind of peace. Behind them, the children's laughter had faded into the evening quiet, replaced by the solemn rhythms of drums that would either celebrate the beginning of genuine understanding or mark the end of two lives offered in service of an impossible dream. Time would tell which it would be. The council fire burned bright against the darkening sky as Margaret and Gus were led into the circle of seated elders. The arrangement was formal and ancient, 12 tribal leaders positioned according to strict protocol, with Running Wolf occupying the place of honor directly across from the fire. Crowfeather sat to his right, his war paint gleaming orange in the firelight, while other chiefs and medicine men completed the sacred circle. Margaret carried the military documents in a leather portfolio, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. The papers represented not just her father's betrayal, but evidence of a systematic deception that could shatter any remaining trust between their peoples. Yet she walked forward with quiet dignity, her resolve unshaken by the gravity of the moment. Swift Arrow had coached them in proper protocol during the afternoon. Margaret would present her evidence first, allowing the council to examine the documents and question her about their contents. Only then would Gus be permitted to offer the sacred peace pipe, assuming the elders deemed them worthy of participating in such a ceremony. Margaret Sinclair, Running Wolf began, his voice carrying the weight of formal judgment. You claim to bring truth where your father brought deception. You offer evidence of betrayal by your own people. Speak now, and know that your words will be weighed against the blood of those who died because of the lies your father carried. Margaret stepped forward, bowing respectfully before opening the leather portfolio. Honored elders, I bring proof of my father's true mission and evidence of the military operation he served. These documents show that he was not simply a missionary seeking to educate children, but a commissioned army officer gathering intelligence for planned attacks on your people. She handed the papers to Running Wolf, who studied them carefully before passing them to the elder beside him. As the documents circulated around the council circle, Margaret explained their contents in clear, precise language that left no room for misunderstanding. This map shows planned positions for military strikes against your winter camps, she said, pointing to specific markings. These reports detail information my father gathered about your defensive capabilities, your tribal leadership, and potential divisions within your communities. This correspondence proves that the educational mission was designed as cover for espionage from the beginning. The effect on the council was immediate and profound. Several elders spoke sharply in Cheyenne, their voices carrying obvious anger and betrayal. Crowfeather's expression darkened with each revelation, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon. But it was Running Wolf's reaction that would prove decisive. The chief studied each document with careful attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of military terminology and tactics. His intelligence was evident as he grasped not just the immediate implications of the papers, but their broader significance for understanding recent events. "These orders are signed by Colonel Harrison," he observed, holding up one particularly damaging document. "The same officer who negotiated the Treaty of 55, the same man who promised that no military actions would be taken against peaceful bands, the same man who ordered my own betrayals during those negotiations," Gus said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the council circle. Running Wolf's gaze fixed on him with laser intensity. "Augustus McReynolds, you confirmed the intelligence your Colonel Harrison needed to plan attacks on families who trusted his promises of protection." "I did." The admission came out flat and simple, carrying no excuses or justifications. "I provided false information about safe passage routes. 3 families died because of intelligence I provided. Their blood is on my hands." Crowfeather erupted in rapid Cheyenne, his voice filled with rage and demands for immediate justice. Other warriors around the circle voiced agreement, their hands moving toward weapons. For a moment, it seemed the council might dissolve into violence. But Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting through the angry voices with surprising authority. "If you kill us for past betrayals, you prove that the cycle of revenge is stronger than the possibility of justice. If you listen to what we offer, you might find a way to prevent future betrayals." The boldness of her intervention stunned the council into silence. That a young white woman would dare interrupt Cheyenne warriors in full council was unprecedented. Yet something in her tone commanded attention rather than outrage. Running Wolf raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "You speak of preventing future betrayals. What do you offer beyond evidence of past deceptions?" "I offer to carry your response to these documents directly to territorial authorities," Margaret replied. "I offer to testify before any tribunal about my father's intelligence mission and Colonel Harrison's illegal orders. I offer myself as proof that some white people value justice over military advantage." The proposal was stunning in its implications. If Margaret publicly exposed the intelligence operation, she would destroy her own reputation and possibly face charges of treason. Yet she was volunteering to do exactly that if it would serve the cause of genuine peace. Crowfeather spoke again, his tone slightly less hostile but still deeply suspicious. Swift Arrow translated, "He asks what guarantee we have that this is not another deception. How do we know you won't simply disappear once you leave our camp, taking this knowledge with you to help refine future betrayals?" It was then that Margaret reached into her pack and withdrew an object that made several elders gasp in recognition. A sacred eagle feather, its pristine white barbs unmarked by blood or violence, its significance unmistakable to anyone familiar with Cheyenne customs. "This feather was given to my father by the territorial governor as a symbol of peaceful intentions," she said. "But I know now that it was tainted by deception from the moment he received it. I return it to you, cleansed by truth, as proof that I seek no advantage from this revelation beyond the possibility of honest relationship between our peoples." Running Wolf accepted the feather with reverent hands, his expression shifting as he grasped the full significance of her gesture. In Cheyenne tradition, the return of such a sacred object carried enormous spiritual weight, representing either genuine repentance or the most cynical form of manipulation. The choice of how to interpret Margaret's action would determine not just her fate, but the future of any relationship between her people and his. Running Wolf held the sacred eagle feather for a long moment, studying its pristine surface in the firelight. The council fell silent, understanding that this moment carried profound significance that would echo through future generations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful judgment. "Margaret Sinclair," he said formally, "you offer this feather as evidence of truthful intentions. But sacred objects can be offered by those who seek to manipulate as easily as by those who seek to heal. How do we test the sincerity of your heart?" Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the evening quiet. Running Wolf raised his hand sharply, and warriors materialized from the shadows around the camp perimeter, their weapons ready. Swift Arrow melted into the darkness to investigate, returning within minutes with news that changed everything. "Soldiers," he reported in rapid Cheyenne. "A full patrol approaching from the east. They carry torches and ride hard, as if pursuing someone." Running Wolf's expression hardened as he grasped the implications. "Colonel Harrison comes for his lost documents. He seeks to silence those who carry proof of his deception." The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Somehow, Harrison had tracked them to the Cheyenne camp, arriving just as Margaret prepared to expose his illegal intelligence operation. The prospect of facing both hostile soldiers and potentially hostile warriors created a crisis that could easily explode into violence. "How many soldiers?" Gus asked, his military experience automatically assessing the tactical situation. 20 riders, Swift Arrow replied, "well armed and moving with purpose." Crowfeather spoke sharply, his tone leaving no doubt about his preferred course of action. Swift Arrow translated, "He says this proves the white woman's story is false. No one voluntarily brings evidence of their own people's crimes unless they serve a larger deception. He believes the soldiers come to retrieve documents that were always intended to fall into our hands. The accusation was clever and deadly. If the council believed that Margaret's revelation was itself part of an elaborate intelligence operation, both she and Gus would be executed as spies. The approaching soldiers provided perfect evidence for such suspicion, but Margaret stepped forward with surprising calm, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Then let me prove my sincerity beyond doubt." From her pack, she withdrew a strip of white cloth torn from her dress. "I'll go to Colonel Harrison under a flag of truce. I'll face him publicly, in front of both your warriors and his soldiers, and demand accountability for his illegal orders." The proposal was either brilliantly courageous or completely suicidal. Approaching Harrison with evidence of his crimes would expose Margaret to immediate arrest, or worse, but it would also force a public confrontation that would prove whether she truly opposed the intelligence operation or remained part of it. Gus felt his heart stop. "Margaret, you can't." "I can, and I will," she interrupted, her voice steady with absolute conviction. "This is why we came here. This is the moment when we prove that some people value truth over safety." Running Wolf studied her face intently, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. "If you do this thing, you understand the consequences. Colonel Harrison will not allow such defiance to go unpunished." "I understand," Margaret replied, "but some choices define who we are. I won't let my father's deception stand as the final word about our people's intentions." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and torchlight began to flicker through the trees surrounding the camp. Harrison's patrol was minutes away from discovering the Cheyenne village, creating a volatile situation that could easily spiral into violence. Gus made his decision with crystalline clarity. "I'm going with her." "No," Margaret said sharply. "Your presence would complicate everything. Harrison has reasons to want you silenced beyond the documents. Let me face him alone. 15 years ago, I wasn't there when my daughter needed protection," Gus interrupted, his voice carrying absolute finality. "I won't make that mistake again." Running Wolf raised his hand for silence as the patrol's torches became visible through the tree line. "If you go to meet these soldiers, you go knowing that some among my people will interpret your actions as either great courage or great treachery. There will be no middle ground." Margaret lifted the makeshift white flag, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "Then let our actions speak for themselves." As they walked toward the edge of camp, Gus felt the weight of Molly's wooden cross in his hands, a reminder of the child he had failed to protect and the woman he might yet help save. Behind them, Cheyenne warriors took positions in the shadows, ready to intervene if the meeting turned violent. Ahead, Colonel Harrison's patrol emerged from the trees, their weapons glinting in the torchlight. The colonel himself rode at their head, his face a mask of controlled fury as he recognized the figures approaching under the white flag. "Miss Sinclair," he called out, his voice carrying across the space between them. "You've led us quite a chase. I trust you have the missing documents that belong to the United States Army." Margaret's response would determine whether this confrontation ended in negotiation or bloodshed, and whether her vision of honest peace could survive the violent legacy of her father's deception. "I have them, Colonel," she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "But they no longer belong to you. Tonight, they belong to the truth." The words hung in the air like a challenge, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test everything both sides claimed to believe about justice, honor, and the possibility of redemption. Colonel Harrison's face contorted with rage as Margaret's words registered. "Miss Sinclair, you are in possession of classified military documents. I order you to surrender them immediately." "I refuse," Margaret replied, her voice carrying across the tense space between the two groups. "These documents prove illegal intelligence operations conducted under the guise of missionary work. They belong in the hands of territorial authorities who can ensure proper investigation." "You speak of treason, young woman. Those documents are vital to national security. They're evidence of war crimes," Gus interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside Margaret. "Evidence of planned attacks on peaceful families ordered by an officer who violated every treaty he signed." Harrison's eyes narrowed as he recognized his former subordinate. "Augustus, McReynolds, I should have known you'd be involved in this betrayal. Always too soft for military necessity." The exchange was being witnessed by both Cheyenne warriors, positioned in the shadows, and Harrison's own soldiers, many of whom looked increasingly uncomfortable with their colonel's aggressive stance. Several younger troopers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly questioning the wisdom of threatening civilians under a flag of truce. It was Running Wolf who broke the deadlock, emerging from the camp with dignified authority. "Colonel Harrison," he said formally, "you stand on sovereign Cheyenne land, threatening people under our protection. Explain your presence." Harrison's expression shifted as he realized the full complexity of his situation. Attacking civilians in the presence of Cheyenne witnesses would create an international incident that even his military connections couldn't suppress. But allowing Margaret to expose his intelligence operation would destroy his career and potentially result in court-martial. "Chief Running Wolf," he said carefully, "I seek the return of stolen military property. These individuals have no authority to negotiate with foreign powers." "We are not foreign powers," Running Wolf replied with quiet steel. "We are the original inhabitants of this land, engaged in legitimate discussions about preventing future violence. If these documents prove deception by military authorities, we have every right to examine such evidence." Margaret seized the moment, withdrawing the intelligence files from her pack. "Colonel Harrison, these orders bear your signature. They detail planned military strikes against winter camps, intelligence gathered through false missionary activities, and systematic deception of tribal leaders who sought peaceful cooperation. Those documents are classified. These documents are illegal," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "They prove that you ordered my father to violate his oath as mine, a minister, to betray people who trusted his religious mission, and to gather intelligence for attacks on families that included children." Several of Harrison's soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their expressions suggesting that Margaret's accusations aligned with their own suspicions about recent orders. Military men, even those serving corrupt officers, typically retained basic respect for honest dealing and the protection of non-combatants. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I formally request that these documents be forwarded to territorial authorities for proper investigation. I volunteer to testify about my father's intelligence activities and your role in ordering them." The offer was devastating to Harrison's position. If Margaret testified publicly about the intelligence operation, it would expose not just his illegal orders, but the broader network of corruption that had enabled such activities. The political consequences would reach far beyond one colonel's career. Running Wolf stepped forward, the sacred eagle feather held prominently in his hands. "Colonel Harrison, this woman has presented evidence of your deception, offered testimony that will expose your crimes, and returned sacred objects tainted by false promises. She has proven her commitment to truth over tribal loyalty. Can you say the same?" The challenge was perfectly crafted, witnessed by both sides, and impossible to evade. Harrison found himself trapped between his illegal orders and the growing realization that his own soldiers were questioning his authority. The junior officers behind him were professional military men who had sworn oaths to uphold justice, not participate in war crimes. It was Lieutenant Morrison, Harrison's second-in-command, who finally spoke. "Colonel, sir, if these allegations are accurate, don't we have a duty to ensure proper investigation? Military justice requires—" "Lieutenant Morrison," Harrison snapped, "you will remember your obligation to follow orders." "Sir, my primary obligation is to the Constitution and the principles of military honor," Morrison replied firmly. "If civilian authorities need to investigate potential violations of treaty obligations, we should facilitate such investigation, not obstruct it." The moment marked a turning point that no one had anticipated. Harrison's own subordinates were choosing conscience over blind obedience, justice over expedience. The corruption that had enabled his intelligence operation was crumbling in the face of simple moral courage. 6 months later, Margaret Sinclair stood before the newly completed schoolhouse that occupied a meadow between Running Wolf's winter camp and the expanded settlement of Bent's trading post. Children from both communities gathered each morning to learn reading, mathematics, and the stories that connected their different cultures. The building itself had been constructed through cooperative effort, with Cheyenne craftsmen contributing traditional techniques while settlers provided materials and tools. Gus McReynolds served as the school's unofficial guardian and medical officer, his mountain cabin abandoned in favor of a small house near the trading post. His medical skills served both communities, and his knowledge of wilderness survival had proven invaluable in helping the school become self-sufficient. More importantly, his presence provided Margaret with the protection and support that allowed her mission to flourish. The legal consequences of their revelations had exceeded all expectations. Colonel Harrison faced court-martial for conducting illegal intelligence operations, while several other officers involved in the deception received disciplinary action. The territorial governor, embarrassed by the exposure of activities conducted in his name, had publicly apologized to Cheyenne leadership and committed to more transparent future relationships. On this particular morning, as Margaret watched children from both communities playing together during recess, she felt a hand touch her shoulder. Gus stood beside her, holding a wooden cross that had been transformed from a symbol of grief into a reminder of redemption earned through courage. "She would have loved this," he said quietly, his eyes taking in the scene of integrated education that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "Your daughter?" Margaret asked, understanding immediately. Molly would have been right in the middle of that group, asking questions and making friends with everyone. His smile carried warmth instead of the bitter sadness that had characterized his memories for so many years. She believed people were basically good, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Margaret nodded, watching a young Cheyenne girl help a settler's son with his arithmetic, while nearby, other children collaborated on a game that seemed to involve equal parts tag and storytelling. "Perhaps that's the real lesson," she said thoughtfully. "Not that we can prevent all deception or betrayal, but that we can choose to build something honest from the wreckage of failed promises." As the school bell rang and children hurried back to their lessons, Gus and Margaret walked toward the building that represented everything they had risked their lives to achieve. Behind them, the new treaty document hung framed in the trading post, handwritten agreement based on truth rather than manipulation, signed by leaders who had learned to trust through the difficult process of surviving mutual betrayal. The document bore the signatures of all parties involved, but more importantly, it carried the hope that future generations might inherit something better than the cycle of deception and revenge that had nearly destroyed them all. In the end, that possibility, purchased through courage, honesty, and the willingness to risk everything for someone else's welfare, proved to be the most precious legacy they could leave.